so much for all the work for women and for everything else.
Well, it's great. And thank you. This is really an honor. So I'm just going to dive right in. And, obviously we now are 14 months into the COVID, COVID pandemic. And we've all been focused on that here, in the US, in Mongolia, Korea, everywhere around the world. But maybe you can specifically talk about what you're working on, what you've been focused on over this last several years, and why the issues you're working on, or the issue you've really focused on, is important in Mongolia.
Yes. No, I work currently for the Green Climate Fund, and it is a fund that is working with more than 140 developing countries to raise their ambition for climate action. Mm-hmm. Basically, Green Climate Fund is at the center of the Paris Agreement, and where all the countries now really ought and have to raise their ambition and action on climate. But for developing countries especially, there is a big need for finance. If they were to leapfrog to greener, low carbon, cleaner investment and development, there is a need for climate finance. So the Paris Agreement also asks developed countries also contribute to developing countries with climate finance, and that's where Green Climate Fund comes. So we channel the funding to low carbon, innovative, paradigm shifting climate investments in developing countries. So, and before I joined the Green Climate Fund, I also when I was working in the parliament, I also led the ministry in charge of environment and green development. So back at home, I also very proactively worked for, environment sustainability issues, which I think is such a key now for the world to go forward, because the top global challenges that we're facing are really very much becoming how do we go forward more sustainably? How do we develop and move forward so that Earth can sustain us as well?
Right. I'm curious. I have two questions, but the first one is really kind of how you've decided in the Green Climate Fund on what projects to focus on, and what your decision making has been like, and how you've helped select projects that can lead to more sustainability and addressing these various risk factors, whether it's climate risk factors, or even things like other or pandemics. Like, are there ways that you have built something into the selection process that helps you figure out which projects are going to be the most resilient?
Right. No, I think it's a very important question. Basically, of course, even with a large volume of funding, and still the funding is very scarce for climate investment in many developing countries, but even if there is some funding available, it's innovation. It's not about just financing. It's about innovation in institutions, right? And how the government, but also public and private sector deliver. So it's innovation in policies and regulations, innovation in capacity building, it's financial innovation, but also it's a technology innovation. It's a very comprehensive set of things that one needs to introduce in a country in order to leapfrog to greener, right? So we are looking for what we call paradigm shift in projects that come into our pipeline. And I would like to use an example. It's very important for institutions like us, but also for countries, of course, to find the leverage points, or what we call places to intervene, right? So it's such a complex problem, not only dealing with climate change, but with pandemic, with economic situation, right? In a complex systems, of course, the best, and then you may have hundreds of challenges and hundreds of solutions, but if you can't invest in 100 solutions, you have to find the right places to intervene, basically the best leverage points, maybe 5 or 6, which will with the smaller shifts in the system, and they can bring major changes in the system, right? And that's this paradigm shifting interventions, as it were. So in very simple terms, and it's not, and again, it's a very simple example. If a government decides to build all the new schools in a green way, energy efficient, right, without coal boilers, for example, and then with good insulation, etc. So the idea is that the financiers, like climate financiers, so impact investors, they will not be paying for building a school, but they will pay for the difference between brown school and green school, right? For this, if there is a difference in prices, but also, of course, for capacity building, for making sure that the regulation in that country has green building codes, for example, right? The right technologies. And then if one supports building the first 10 green schools, then to make sure that the next 100 schools are green, right? So that's the paradigm shift. That's this place to intervene, because one knows how can one do it. And of course, one important thing is you cannot just deliver with only public funding. You have to have private sector also on board, of course, and around the country, around the world as well. So 40% of our funding, for example, is going to projects that we partner with private sector, and that's where a scarce public sector money, $1, leverages, for example, another $5 or $10, but that will allow private sector to de-risk their investment, make them braver, right? Mm-hmm. And so that one comes up with bespoke solutions, and then private sector also sort of leapfrogs to, rather than trying to build a brown building, they'll say, okay, no, we'll go to and build a green one. So I think that's the issue of, again, for everyone. Now, it's not about choosing between brown and green. It's about how do we do things differently so that every decision is filtered through climate lens or through gender lens and women.
And do you find, I guess my question is really about how to build like political will for this, but in two questions, really. One is, if we could think about a time when there wasn't COVID, like how responsive were governments and how willing were they to take this on? But then with COVID, and we see this in the US, so I think not an unusual thing where people are so focused on COVID that the concern is that every other issue falls sort of lower in the priority stack, So just, how to build political will, both in times that are more normal, but more particularly in times of crisis, which we're in, to make sure that while we're addressing the crisis that's right in front of us, we're also thinking about the other crises that are kind of looming on the horizon.
Yes, no, I think it's very important. And from my times when I was in politics back at home in Mongolia, and then when I served as a member of parliament, I learned very well that for any important reform, for any policy and solution to go forward and to be implemented, of course, two things are key. One is political will, and even more importantly, I think, is the public attitude, the right public attitude, and the public support for the reform or for a policy, right? So, and then of course, it's very important. Very often, public support, public pressure creates the political will, right? Often, political will is not there until, and then in order to have the public support, of course, or public right understanding, there is a huge need for communicating. What are the problems, challenges, situation? Of course, it's very important that also everyone is very active as well in our society. And then of course, we're very impressed and very happy to see the youth movement for climate, and not only the youth, unprecedented public support in the last few years as well. But I think that the consumers are completely changing the way they see, how they, well, the so I think the momentum is really being created. Again, still much to be done, but we absolutely see change in the consumer's mind, which now finally seeing the government's policies changing to a certain degree. And with the recent US administration, of course, it's given a huge boost to that as well, seeing the last week President Biden's summit on climate. So with US coming back, China hugely importantly, announcing that by 2060 they will go for carbon neutrality, net zero path. Of course, where we work now, South Korea announced net zero, Japan, but also, of course, European Union countries, and another 120 countries. So if you put everybody together, it's almost 70% of the global economy and 65% of the global emissions that now just joined the net zero race. Of course, again, I think it's hugely important that this political will is being created, but we also know that the devil is in details, and the implementation is often, especially with the political cycles of only 3, 4, 5 years, it's very important to keep this momentum. And for that, I think this public attitude, public support, but what every citizen, every private sector company, but also civil society, academia, everybody needs to be doing is very, very important. But with the COVID context, we could see from previous economic financial crisis, for example, 2008, right? We see a dip in emissions usually, and then the big sort of bouncing back. There were some analysis and research showing that although last year in 2020, the emissions went down by 7-8 percentage, but there is a danger that it's going to bounce back again. So that's why this important momentum saying, no, if we build back differently, if we go sort of different path of recovery, right? And if we give conscientiously or proactively support green investments rather than subsidizing again fossil fuel sector, etc., then there is a chance that the emissions will not bounce back, but at least slow down with the path.
Yeah, and I think that's important about political will. Is it really is obviously there's like a lot of pressure from consumers and citizens that can really push that political will to kind of face the problems in front of it. Obviously you're a woman and you've been in parliament, you've been a minister, you're obviously now a leader in the climate, sort of our climate response. Can you talk a little bit about how being a woman has affected, or how you see it affecting your leadership style and your ability to be effective? I think, because I think often we just say, oh, of course women, are leaders and we just need their voices at the table. And that's true. But I also think it's really important for women who are leaders to talk about like what, how they see their gender impacting their work. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yes. When I joined politics in my early mid-30s, the first question I had from a journalist back at home in Mongolia was, how is it for you how is it different for you as a woman to be a member of parliament or politician compared to men? And then I couldn't quite understand the question at the beginning, because I really didn't look from the women or gender angle. I'm an earth scientist by profession, and I did my research and other work, and I never felt sort of too much of a difference. But then when I joined politics, when the question came, I said, of course I don't see much of a difference. I can do as much as why you are asking the question? And I think I was quite naive then when I joined, without much understanding, because I was really thrown into politics, right? Of course, once I joined, I understood it very well that we really proactively have to conscientiously and proactively support women and women's quota, just because they're so underrepresented. And then I remember there were some terms in the parliament where we were only 3 women out of 76 in the parliament. So, of course, to your question, how does it make myself feel differently as a woman politician? Of course, if you're so underrepresented, you just feel huge responsibility of doing much more, delivering much more, because you are representing so many women, right? And then you have to become their voice. You have, and I of course, I learned very fast that I have to be, not only represent, but I fight for, which I did as well, for introducing quota for women. I was the first female leader of a political party. So what we did, we introduced first time in our political party bylaws, compared to other bigger parties, introduced women's quota for running for the elections. Then I was the one who was very instrumental in introducing quota. And then, of course, I worked with other women on legislations on violence against women, on also even I think a lot of work that I've done on rights of people with disabilities, especially children with disabilities. Of course, I did it because of being a mom, a woman, and then we were one of the also the first families that created and founded Special Olympics in Mongolia, and parents with children with Down syndrome. We set up a sort of parents association, which now grown into a bigger NGO. So I think, of course, we had, of course, men supporting, but I could see especially with the issues of social inclusion and women's inclusion, you just, whether we like it or not, it's more women that fight for those causes. And even for NGOs, if we see civil society organizations, NGOs, and I've also run a couple of NGOs still, and chair of the Zurich Foundation back at home. And then I could see in civil societies, again, 70 or 80% of the active part of leading civil society are women.
Right.
So,
yeah, there are women leaders everywhere, right? Yeah, in
yes,
the civil society.
yes.
Yeah. I think just broadly, if you could think about, like, how would you in 5 years measure success in terms of what you're doing? And how would you want to see, if we have this conversation in 5 years, what would you want us to be talking about then?
I think it's important, very important, to measure success in terms of impact. One can, again, my experience in politics shows that one can come up with a number of legislations or documents on paper. They can even be approved, maybe, but if they just sitting on the table and not being implemented, and that's when I think the key challenge comes, implementing those policies. Again, with this huge momentum that's now being created with net zero drive to having the emissions in the next decade, having again the decade after, and then hoping to reach net zero emissions by 2050, which is, I think, one of the key, key ambitions should be for the globe. I just hope that they will not be just sitting on the table, on the paper. And for that, I think every one of us has to really try very hard in what we do. And you don't have to be working for a climate institution, or you don't have to be working for an environmental NGO, but everyone in their work, whether it's private sector, government, NGO, is just doing things differently from what we've been doing before. We can't afford, to, just to lead the same way of development, like the last 200 years of industrialization, where it was, let's just develop, let's just consume more, let's, just grow first, and then deal with the waste, deal with environment, deal with climate later. We can't afford doing it because it's not only the next generation, it's even this generation and our kids that, and then ourselves will be facing, I think, the consequences of climate change and coming much faster than we were expecting. And I think this is the key challenge, but also everyone has to contribute.
Well,
And
I really feel like, no, I would just say I feel like having people like you engagement gives me a lot of confidence. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, just close us out. And Oyun, thank you so much, really, for this wonderful conversation. It's so impressive. So thank you.
No, thank you so much for this opportunity as well. And yeah, good luck. And then thanks for all the work that you've done before as well, and you are doing.